We didn't have the power of God, so to speak, to need to have the wisdom and love and prudence of gods to be able to guide it. So World War II comes along, and all of a sudden we actually can destroy the whole world in a relatively short interaction. You're like, we are not safe stewards for this much power, because the power that we did have, whether it was catapults or whatever, we always used that power to kill other people. And we used the power to harm the environment. Like, we've been actually cutting trees down faster than they could reproduce for a very, very long time. We just could only do it at so much scale. With industrial capacity, we started to be able to do it at much larger scale. But you're like, okay, we've used our technological power to damage nature and kill each other, and then create class systems that would suppress each other. We've used it that way for a long time. We've not been the greatest stewards of power. Now we have the power to actually mess everything up. How do we make it through that technological adolescence?
When I think of Daniel Schmachtenberger, it reminds me of Professor Xavier hooked up to the Cerebro. I've never met anybody who's able to grapple with all of the complex things that are happening in the world at the same time. And with that, he paints a very interesting picture about the place we're in as a global society and the changes that we need to make it through this period. But nonetheless, despite all of the awareness of everything that could go terribly wrong, he remains optimistic. And in this podcast, we talk about all of the situations and what the case is and what the real purpose and way in which our optimism can play a role in bringing about the reality that we all are looking for. Check this podcast out with Daniel Schmachtenberger. The truth is that we're all the master, we're all the healer, we're all the mystic.
Give it up one time for Aubrey Marcus.
Daniel Schmachtenberger, it's great to have you back, my brother.
And very good to see you, my friend. Very
yes, indeed. And you were fresh off a very powerful podcast on the Joe Rogan Experience with Tristan Harris. And you guys spent 3 hours really covering the bases of some of the challenges we're facing right at this very unique moment in human history. And I would like for you to take a moment to just summarize in a cursory way some of the issues that you explored on that. And from there, we're going to go a lot deeper into some of the solutions and how we can be active participants in creating those solutions, and the necessity to hold this kind of right relationship with optimism through what could be seen as this Kobayashi Maru unwinnable situation. But of course, as Captain Kirk showed us, there's a way. There's always a third door. There's always another lane that we can take. And so I'm excited to explore these issues with you.
Yeah, so you said there's always a third door. Maybe we'll take an exploration of what the two doors in front of us that both seem to suck currently are, as a way of explaining what the one way of looking at kind of what an overview might be, to then say, what is the third door, or the third attractor we're looking for? And we did get to discuss this at a bit of depth with Joe, and having some other places so people can check that out. But just for a quick summary, for whatever total human history is, something like 300,000 years of Homo sapiens, we never got to a population over 500 million until the Industrial Revolution. And then we went we didn't get to a first billion until about 1815. Before the Industrial Revolution, the number of people we had and the amount of power that we had in total, military power and environmental harm power, like, we just couldn't destroy the world. We just didn't have the capacity to do that. With the Industrial Revolution and starting to move into massive industrial scale capacities, we went from 500 million people to, around 8 billion people in what's really functionally the blink of an eye from evolutionary timescales. And not only did we go from 500 million to 8 billion, the resource per capita being used went up many hundreds of fold, right? If we look at how many what are called extracorporeal calories my life depends on, how much energy beyond the food that I eat, the average person right now, averaging the fact that there's so many people in poverty, are still, I believe the current number is around 300x the corporeal calories. So however much I eat, there's about 300 times more energy than that's involved in making my life work. And that obviously means for those of us in the affluent West, it's way more than that to average. So way more people, way more resource consumption per capita with industrial tech. We're coming up to a time period where the cumulative effect of a few hundred years of that is hitting planetary boundaries, right? Overfishing of the oceans, excessive pollution in terms of nitrogen runoff in dead zones. And so we have all these environmental issues, whether we're talking about total loss of biodiversity, loss of forests, loss of key species, and also running out of key resources on one side of a linear materials economy where we extract stuff from nature faster than nature can make it to turn it into trash faster than nature can process it. We try to do that exponentially because we try to exponentiate our monetary supply because you have to make interest. The interest means that I need more money next year in the total monetary supply than there is this year. And that's not even including growth of the economy beyond interest, fractional reserve banking and all that. But that means I need to exponentiate my monetary supply, which means I have to have an exponential growth of goods and services, which means an exponential growth of the linear materials economy in relationship to a finite planet that you can't run exponential growth on forever. So industrial era tech getting bigger and bigger and globalizing still couldn't extinct us immediately, but the cumulative effects actually break the planet down. So we're coming up to the place where around 300 years of the kind of cumulative effects are getting us towards like planetary boundaries and fragility all over the place. Then add to that exponential tech, which is well beyond well beyond industrial era tech. And now, I guess we'll go back to World War II and the development of the bomb. And that was the first tech, right? Post-industrial, the beginning of nuclear phase. That was the first tech where we actually had the ability to kill everything all at once. And it's really important to understand that for the whole history of the world and every philosopher who ever thought about human power and whatever, we didn't have the ability to destroy the whole world. We didn't have the power of God, so to speak, to need to have the wisdom and love and prudence of God to be able to guide it. So World War II comes along and all of a sudden we actually can destroy the whole world in a relatively short interaction. You're like, we are not safe stewards for this much power because the power that we did have, whether it was catapults or whatever, we always used that power to kill other people. And we used the power to harm the environment. Like we've been actually cutting trees down faster than they could reproduce for a very, very long time. We just could only do it at so much scale. With industrial capacity, we started to be able to do it at much larger scale. But you're like, okay, we've used our technological power to damage nature and kill each other and then create class systems that would suppress each other. We've used it that way for a long time. We've not been the greatest stewards of power. Now we have the power to actually mess everything up. How do we make it through that technological adolescence? So you look at the history of Europe in particular, but you can look at the history of the world, and it's defined by the major empires warring with each other. And there's actually this beautiful animation that shows a time lapse of the rise and fall of empires. It's set to like some kind of classical music. We should put the link in the show notes. I'll send it to you because you get the sense of like, it's just a history defined by bloody war. And then with the bomb comes the first time where the major empires can never fight again.
Yeah.
And yet the whole thing is defined by fighting. You're like, how the fuck are we going to do that? So we had to make this entire world system to ensure that we don't fight, which was the post-World War II system, which was the Bretton Woods monetary system, plus create the United Nations and all of the international governmental organizations and mutually assured destruction. It was like a whole world system. And the key was, okay, the major reason we fight is to compete over scarce resources. So in order to make sure that everybody can get more, because everybody wants more, but we don't have to take each other's stuff, which becomes the basis for fighting, we just have to make exponentially more stuff all the time. So let's make a monetary system that allows us to just make exponentially more stuff. It's so positive sum, so abundance oriented that everybody can keep getting more without having to kill each other. Now, of course, the major nations will still oppress the minor nations, and class systems within the major nations will oppress lower class within them. But nonetheless, the major empires don't have to kinetically war. But that world system was, that was based on globalization and exponential growth. You just can't keep running that thing forever because eventually you hit planetary boundaries everywhere, and we're there. Also, it said, let's make the world so globally interconnected that you don't want to go to war with anyone because the computer that you're talking over is made on 6 continents, the supply chains. And so whoever you bomb, you end up messing up the thing that you depend on. So let's make us so interconnected. But then what that also means is the system becomes so fragile that you get a virus in one part of the world and you start getting cascading shutdowns of supply chains across the whole world. And so you get to a place where the fragility means that the inevitable collapses that happen locally can start to have global effects. So you can't keep doing that thing. You have to create more resilience in the system. And the other key part of how we made it through the World War II nuclear tech is mutually assured destruction. If they fire, we fire. And so nobody can use the weapons. But that only worked when you had two parties that had one catastrophe weapon. Now, with drones and bioweapons and cyber weapons that can do catastrophic level of damage on infrastructure, you have dozens of catastrophe weapons beyond the bomb. And you don't have two actors that have them. You have dozens of actors, including non-state actors. So you're like, how do you do mutually assured destruction when you don't even know what type of weapon you're talking about or who has it? You don't. So basically, up until World War II, the world did not have to take responsibility for global destruction power. Humans never had to think that way. At World War II, we had to think that way. We built an entire world system that bought us like 75 years, but did it at the cost of planetary fragility, supply chain and planetary fragility, literal biosphere fragility, and driving the tech that moved us from one catastrophe weapon to dozens of catastrophe weapons. So basically that phase is over. And now we're entering a new phase, and there is no previous precedent for how to make it through this phase, which is we can't keep running exponential growth of the materials economy. We can't keep doing the cumulative industrial thing, let alone the new exponential tech thing the way we have. And so the two doors, let me come back. I took a tangent. Mm-hmm. Exponential tech in particular, it's not just exponential tech because it's the cumulative effect of industrial tech within exponential tech, AI, computation, et cetera, sitting on top of it. Exponential tech is so much more powerful than all the legacy forms of tech and all the legacy forms of power that only the groups that are developing and deploying exponential tech will really define the future, because everyone who isn't will just lose. This is not it should be that way. This is a real politic assessment of it is that way. So then we have to say, are the groups that are developing and deploying that power doing it? Like, what is the value system they're doing it oriented to? What is the underlying philosophy or civics and that doesn't look really good. The exponential tech radically decentralizes power in some ways and centralizes it in other ways. These are the two bummer doors that we're looking for a third door on. Decentralizes it means drones are way easier to get access to than nukes. Nukes are really, really technologically hard to make. Like enriching uranium is really hard and it's pretty easy to control. But weaponizing drones, not so hard, meaning tiny little non-state actors can get them and can do really, really serious damage. Same with cyber weapons, the same with CRISPR and biotech making like real advanced biowarfare abilities cheap in the next few years. So on one hand, you have, and we already see versions of this, which is little actors being able to pollute the information ecology with nonsense and affect the minds of so many people. So you've got like on one side, the exponential tech that is supposed to democratize things actually is democratizing catastrophic capacity, meaning catastrophe weapons for everybody. How the fuck does the world make it through catastrophe weapons for everybody? So one way that one of the doors that sucks is we just collapse, like catastrophe and cascading catastrophes of an increasingly fragile world with increasingly more decentralized tech, with increasingly more radicalized people from the nature of the way the media environment is radicalizing, the world will just kind of break. That's one path. And there's a million different versions of that, right? But that's one path. The other path is to control that and make sure that doesn't happen requires the only way of trying to control it right now is like the way China's trying to do it, which is totalized surveillance. Let's make sure that we know nobody's building drones in their basement or building cyber weapons or building AI weapons in their basement. In order to do that, I got to know what everyone's doing in their fucking basement, right? And so ubiquitous surveillance means you don't have to have catastrophe for everyone, but it means you end up getting totalizing dystopias. Exponential tech, AI empowered dystopias. Those are the two doors we have, right? So that the exponential tech can decentralize power, it can also centralize power. And it's already doing that naturally. Like when you see there's really one search engine, right? You have one search engine that's bigger than all the other ones combined. Google. You have one online store that's bigger than all the other online stores combined. Amazon. You have one social media network, Facebook, that owns Instagram and WhatsApp and whatever, that has more attention than everything else. The network dynamics themselves already create centralization of power. And so you've got decentralization and centralization, both of which are happening in ways that are not really guided by any values we would want for the world.
Right.
And so you either have dystopias or catastrophes. Those are the two doors. All right, well, how do we have a 21st century that is neither catastrophic nor dystopic? It means you have to be able to bind all the catastrophes without some top-down state binding it or some top-down power binding it. So how do you have some form of power that can check and balance all of this exponential tech power, but that has checks and balances itself, so it isn't dystopic? I would say that's a fair way of defining the third door we want. How do we prevent all the catastrophes where the mechanisms that prevent them are themselves not dystopic?
So one of the things that I've really identified and felt for a long time is the development of consciousness and the rewriting of our own understanding of who we are collectively as one world, one species, one organism called Earth, interconnected, has not developed at the rate that our technology has. It just hasn't. And you can look and blame a variety of different causes for this. Potentially the prohibition and the war against psychedelic medicine, which is a powerful tool to help bring people into states of awareness of the interconnectedness. I mean, you do enough of that and you realize that you are not so different from that person next to you or that tree or that animal or that environment. This happens over and over again. It's a reliable effect of this, but that has been prohibited. You can also go back even deeper to the nature-based wisdom traditions that have been largely suppressed by top-down religious organizations and different other forces, whether it's state or whether it's religion, that's actually suppressed a lot of this wisdom. Look at the burning of the witches, people who carried these wisdom traditions that have been suppressed. So a lot of these different ways in which we could have been evolving our consciousness along with our technology haven't happened. And we're making a rally right now to try and catch up real quick. But some damage has been significantly done, and it's landed us in this position right now where our consciousness is still in that war mentality. All right, maybe the proliferation of nuclear weapons has stopped the nation states from being able to kinetically fight, but we're still in fighting mindset. We haven't changed that separation mentality that says, I am going to defeat you. We're just using now different bot farms to destabilize nations and compete in other economic ways. And, all of these different things that are happening now between the nations that are competing and between people that are competing within political systems, et cetera. So what needs to happen is a very quick catch up of our consciousness, it seems, which in turn could then provide the avenue for the third door, which is people creating an emergent understanding of something, of a new way of doing things that's different from the mentality itself that's brought us to this position.
Yeah, so when you talk about a new mentality, it's a new basis for choice, right? Because all the problems we're talking about are the result of human choices. And technology's a massive lever on human choice. I can attack somebody with my hands. I'm much more effective if I get to extend my hands with a knife, more with a gun, and a lot more with a major nation state's military, right? Or an ICBM. But it's a technological extension of a particular choice-making type of process. First, it's important to note that it's not true that technology is values agnostic. It's neither good nor bad. It's just power, and how we wield it is just based on our consciousness. It's extending our consciousness, but it's influencing it as well.
It's a very good point, because I've often gotten stuck in this kind of reductionist argument that technology is agnostic. You don't like Instagram, just use it in a different way. Use it in a way and yes, you can use it for good, and there are ways to use it better. But it does have a built-in value system, and I think that's something that the social dilemma, and it's something that you guys covered in a really, powerful way on that podcast, was understanding like, okay, these tools aren't neutral. Because you can say that about guns as well. Like, and I think that's actually a fair argument. The guns don't kill people. It's people pulling the trigger that kill people. But the guns are far more neutral than the algorithms, which are really designed to actually pull people apart and garner attention it's like the guns don't beg people to fire them. It just gives them the opportunity to fire them. But the social media systems are actually in some ways even more nefarious because they have a built-in kind of incentive and a built-in way about them that is actually more harmful.
Well, social media is, of all of the technologies that influence patterns of human behavior and human psyche, it's the most powerful one we have evolved yet. Because that's what it is, a tool intentionally designed to do that, right? Like, the intention of the tool is to take all of the world's content and curate it uniquely based off of personalized tracking of my behaviors in a way that optimizes my behaviors for purposes, right? For engagement and advertisers and like that. And so it's using exponential technology, specifically personalized data harvesting, decentralized content curation, and artificial intelligence to affect certain outcomes of behavior mod. And it's why it's important to understand these companies are different in kind than big agriculture or big pharma or even big defense, is that those are not intended to be multi-billion person AI empowered personalized behavior modification systems, right? This is actually a behavior modification system down to a personalized level that is AI empowered at a scale that dwarfs nation states. That's different. It is such a different category of tech that it really needs thought of not just as a corporation in the market sector, in the private sector, because like already it has changed the nature of what the market itself is. To be able to be effective in the market, you have to be effective in marketing. Now that there are monopolies of where everyone's attention is, to be effective in marketing means you have to be effective in marketing on Facebook, which means appealing to its algorithm, which actually means that the Facebook algorithm has captured the invisible hand of the market and turned it into an algorithm, right? Which means there is no longer a thing called a market in an Adam Smith sense. There is now a fully privatized, captured set of algorithms that determines what succeeds and what doesn't succeed, very largely. So yeah, it's to think of it from the old lens of like, we believe in capitalism and private enterprise and blah, blah, it's just nonsense. But now let's come back to technology is not values agnostic. Technology extends human choice, which is human choice arising from human motivation, which is our values and our understanding and our desires and all like that. But it doesn't just extend the power of it, it also influences it. This is true for every piece of tech, actually. And cumulative tech, if I had made this shirt by hand, right, depending upon how deep I go, I raised the sheep and then sheared the sheep and made the wool and knitted the fucking thing, I would treat the shirt very differently than my ability to press one button on Amazon and get quite a few of them and to see which ones I like, right? So built right into the ease with which I get the thing and can replace it affects the nature of how I engage with it, that affects, multiplied by all human behavior and not just shirts, but all the things I want, affects the nature of waste management and the environment writ large, right? Like, my ability to get shit easily means I'm going to go through a bunch of shit, right? Like, whereas if it was much harder to get, I just wouldn't go through the shit in the same way. It means that I'm not even going to think about, do I really need this shit in the same way that I would if I had to make it. So the nature of the way that things get made easier affects human values, right? In almost invisible ways. So we go back to the first really classic example. I mean, we can obviously go to stone tools, but the plow is my favorite example because that's the beginning. It's a good place to take as the beginning of what we call recorded history and civilization, where we started creating cities and empires. Once we were able to create a plow, which means we were able to create grain and store grain. So we started having stores of calories rather than just hunter-gatherer, right? The hunter-gatherer to agrarian transition. But we got something like 300,000 years of Homo sapien history before that to then have maybe only 10,000 after that. This is not enough to have affected really our genetic makeup or anything. But before that, there's the best evidence indicates that pretty much everybody around the world was animistic. Right? In North America, South America, Asia, wherever, the spirit of the animals, the spirit of the river, the spirit of the trees, there was a sense of a spirit of everything, right? So if I'm a hunter and a gatherer, I might kill an animal, but I'm making this prayer as I kill the animal that says, I am killing the buffalo. And then when I die, my body will go into the ground and create grass that its grandchildren will eat. And there's this great cycle of life, and we're connected, and I do a prayer. And so I can believe in the spirit of the buffalo and kill it because I need to eat. But can I take that buffalo and domesticate it into an ox, castrate it, put put things through its nose to then be able to yoke it and beat it all day long to pull this plow, and still believe in the spirit of the ox or the buffalo? Not really. Not really, right? Like the beginning of
it's at least very uncomfortable if you have to do that, right? And that discomfort drives the separation.
Yeah, because either I have to just say it's just a dumb cow and man was given dominion over earth, or I have to say, no, there's a spirit of what it's like to be it, and I'm an evil motherfucker, right? Who's just
right.
torturing this thing all the time. And so, which is why in the American slavery system, which was so much worse than other forms of slavery for some important reasons, which was other places didn't have the Declaration of Independence saying all men are created equal and all deserve the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Like feudalism didn't make that claim. There was a very clear class system. The nobility had a better deal than everybody else. But when you make that, all men are created equal and they all deserve life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and then you want to keep slavery, you have to do some weird mental gymnastics to justify that. And it was at the time stuff like, well, the blacks are a subspecies, more like the animals, right? There was a lot of that kind of nonsense that happened that could justify that immoral kind of behavior. But that was already what we were doing with the animals when the plow came. So the plow ended animism, right? There's a lot of different scholars who will kind of debate fine points, but there's a kind of overarching assessment. And so let's say I have a tribe that says, no, I'm not going to castrate the thing and beat it all the time. I'm just going to continue to hunt and gather. Well, those people aren't going to populate nearly as much as the people who get the plow and can create a lot more calories and support a much larger population and make it through the famines. As a result, the non-animistic ideas will proliferate and the other ones will die out and then get killed off in the tribal warfare between the ones that have a much larger population and more resources. So the ideas themselves that caught on were the ideas that lent themselves to power, not necessarily the ideas that lived in harmony with nature or were true, good, and beautiful. And similarly, when you're talking about burning the witches to death, somehow, in the name of this Jesus guy who said, let he who has no sins cast the first stone, and who says, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do, while they're nailing him up. Somehow in his name, we think that burning witches to death makes like weird mental gymnastics to make that shit happen, right? And then the witches are people who maybe believed in herbs or whatever it was, but something that was, let's say there were matriarchal cultures that were generally more peaceful, but we offered them the Bible and they either got that or they got the sword. There was a place where the more violent cultures, when they interacted with the more peaceful cultures, killed the more peaceful cultures, took their stuff and moved on. Yep. So the thing that you're mentioning about the kind of cultural breakdown is the thing that was selected for in the process of resource competition and war. Now, then we get to a place where the wars become big enough that nobody can win them. But what's been selected for is the ability to win wars. Economic wars as well as kinetic wars. So you're like, okay, what's been selected for a long time will now self-terminate, which means we have to consciously select something that can make it through rather than unconsciously just have it selected via domination capacity. And that's the unique turning point we're at.
And it's also not, very well said. And it's not only what we've been selected and almost bred through these thousands of years of this mentality. It's also the stories that guide the culture, in which there's always the story of redemptive violence. That's the way that actually wins, and this was a really potent critique of Avatar that came from Charles Eisenstein when I was talking to him, because I have an Avatar pinball machine. I was real fired up about it. And I was like, yeah, fucking Avatar, great movie, and he's like, well, there's a huge problem with that. And the problem is that it's still the same thing. Somehow the Na'vi people got enough power together that they were actually able to kill and destroy the other conquerors, which is the same story. It's the same war mentality. It wasn't the new story like you could read about in Starhawk's Fifth Sacred Thing, where they actually changed the mentality of the conquering tribe at that point and rewrote their understanding of how to live in peace and in a different way. It was still the same old story, but just told in a really attractive way, in this Dances with Wolves attractive, kind of format. But it seems like not only do we have to rewrite our own selection, this natural selection that's occurred to select us for this environment, but we also have to rewrite the stories that are guiding us so that we can understand like what's the new way of the third door. How does that even look? And we're starting, one of the ways in which I'm optimistic is we're starting to see some stories turn out like that. Like there was a Disney movie, Raya and the Last Dragon. And that story actually has this type of solution where the enemy was not ultimately defeated by a good that eventually got more powerful, even though they were good, and smashed them. The enemy was defeated by making the enemy aware that this lust for power and this need to destroy the other was actually a delusion, and to have them lay down their arms and live in peace. Like that's a different story. And I think those stories hopefully will start to get told more and more, because the futility of this system, it leads only one direction, and it's destruction.
I never heard Charles's critique of Avatar in terms of its narrative. I had a very similar one when I watched it, because the movie was done so well that it was very easy to just like fall in love with the Omaticaya, and
Totally.
I'm like, fuck, I want to watch it again because I miss them. But I was also equally bothered instantly by the narrative landscape, because even before the point you made is they were warriors, right? Some of them, the men were warriors. And you're like, well, wait, if they're all peaceful, what the fuck are they warriors for? Like there's a little conflict in who were they warring before the white folk, the ultimatum or whatever it was came.
Unobtainium.
But it's been many years since I saw it. But the other thing was that I really, really disliked was it was very much a classic and then magic happened solution, because they were losing. And then all the animals just came in and kind of magically turned the tide as a result of the prayer or whatever they did. Mm-hmm. I heard from a number of Native American elders that like, we fucking hated that show, because obviously it was kind of glorifying a version of what the Native American process is. And we're like, we prayed around the goddamn tree and the animals didn't just start fighting the white men. Like that just didn't happen. and so like, that's not the right answer. The right answer is the dudes with the guns are going to beat the dudes with the bow and arrows. We have to do something other than just, and then magic happens. And so one of the other things is like, it was fundamentally a Luddite narrative. It was an anti-tech narrative. White guys with tech bad, right? Something that is kind of high nature, low tech good, but there's no way to bridge how the low tech thing will not lose to the high tech thing, because the tech equals power, right? Mm-hmm. And so ultimately, like, I feel very convinced that there are no futures that work that don't require complete catastrophe first that are low tech. There just aren't.
Yep.
Because anyone who goes in that we can be more peaceful through low tech permaculture, great. You will not direct the topology of the world as a whole. The dudes building the AI weapons will, and the other forms of like advanced technology. So you've got to say, all right, we know that there were Buddhist cultures and Jainist cultures and matriarchal cultures that got slaughtered by warring cultures. We know white Tibet isn't there anymore. We don't need to try to build something that just definitely loses. But how do you not lose to something that is putting all of its attention at effective dominance without becoming better than it at that thing? That's a really tricky question, right? And I actually don't think it was really possible before the type of tech we have today. I think the type of tech we have actually makes it possible to create certain kinds of very adaptive and abundance generating power that are not offensively oriented and can actually facilitate collective intelligence and collective sovereignty and things like that. That doesn't mean that's how it's currently being developed, but could be developed that way.
Yeah, there's a saying in the permaculture, which is the problem is the solution. If this exponential tech is the problem, well, then likely it's also the solution as well. But it's a different application of it, which must come from a different consciousness, which must come from a different culture, which must come with different stories. And so these are the things that must happen, that must weave its way through. Like, a lot of people want to demonize McDonald's and say like, oh, McDonald's serving all of this. Well, McDonald's is feeding a lot of people. So instead of demonizing McDonald's, how about utilizing this network of ability to distribute food, but with a different consciousness about how they source their animals, where they source their food, what they're offering on the menu, the education around what is actually nourishing and what is not nourishing. But it's using the actual infrastructure of the thing itself rather than saying, let's destroy that and just, Molotov cocktail all McDonald's. Well, then people are just going to be fucking hungry. But if we use that infrastructure and the technology that they've developed, but train it in a different way, that's how you're going to actually affect change. And it's, in my mind, the same with tech. It has to come from the inside, almost like the inside out, rather than the outside forces squashing what's already in existence.
So let's give an example of what that could look like for social media, since that is, as far as tech goes, both at the very cutting edge and the thing that is most debasing the social and cultural systems we've had so far.
Let me take a quick detour there to explain. You were one of the most intelligent, self-aware human beings I've ever had the pleasure of encountering and conversing with. And you told a story on that podcast about how you intentionally trained the algorithm to show you police brutality videos for a little while, and then police, like police being heroes and fighting for the good, and trained yourself in both ways. And even though you knew you were running the experiment, you were still affected by it. And I think this is important to recognize, like, don't get confused that you're going to be somehow so much more powerful than social media, that you're going to be immune to its natural effects. So if you want to just share that so people understand, like, what it's actually doing to the human psyche and how almost irresistible it is to fall into these traps.
There's actually an example that just came to mind as you were saying that I think many people have experienced, which is let's say you're watching a good nature show and you're following the deer, then the wolf is a bad guy and it's really terrible when the baby deer gets eaten and everybody's really bummed. But if you're watching another nature show and you're following the wolf and you see the baby wolf grows up and then the mom has to feed its babies and it already lost 4 hunts.
And the wolves are hungry and they're starving and you see their ribs.
Then it captures the deer and it's like, it's a big celebration. And you're like, it's the same fucking thing depending upon which one we were following. So it's so interesting to watch how our own emotions can feel so differently about that scene, just even based on the context, right? Yep. And if I take any war or any cultural conflict and I look at it from the interior propaganda of one side of it, I'll start empathizing with it. There was a project that was done many years ago on Second Life where it was done with women who were on either side of the Israel-Palestine border who had very strong views on it. So like Zionists and pro-Palestinian that were kind of on the caliphate side. But for a week, it was something like this. For a week, they took on an avatar in a made environment of the other side to see what it would be like if I went from being an Israeli woman on this side to being a Palestinian person with these experiences on the other side. And even though the tech was pretty low, it was enough that it changed their views within a week of having that vicarious experience in the VR environment. This is an example of all the really terrible things the metaverse will be. There are some good things that the same tech could do. Sure. And the ability to take on different avatars and have different vicarious experiences is one of the pretty awesome ones. If done consciously, right? If done as a empathy training and a perspective seeking process.
And little threads of this are starting to weave its way into the stories. Like imagine the old Star Wars. Stormtroopers were absolutely dehumanized. You just blast as many of those white fuckers as you can, and you blast them and you keep blasting them. And as many as you blast, the better off you are. And then in the recent retelling of Star Wars, there was one hero that eventually took off his white stormtrooper mask and was like, this is fucked up. I don't want to do this. I was pressured into this situation in the first place, and I had no interest in this. I'm going to join the other side. Now, of course, there's still the issues in Star Wars with redemptive violence and the good versus evil and them never actually coming to any kind of union and any kind of agreement of balance and respect for each other. But nonetheless, it was starting to show that these are not just all dehumanized evil. There's a person underneath that white mask or that black mask. And they're a real person and that person has a real life and real emotion. And it was a rehumanization, at least in partial, for this idea that is, I think, helping support the new narrative that I think is really important for this third door.
Okay, so I'll finish the example you were bringing up about social media because it's so important for everybody. But let's come back to this redemptive violence thing because we need to address it. With regard to social media, we evolved in an environment where we could trust our senses to be give us a good sense of the world very differently than we can through telecommunicated media. Because if I am just looking around in the area that I'm in, what I see is pretty actually reflective of the world that I happen to be in, at least in the bandwidth of light that I can see and whatever that's relevant for my survival and evolutionary purposes. And it happens to be that everyone else is going to see about the same thing, right? It's not going to be that I'm seeing bears and they're not seeing bears. And so there's a shared basis of sense making, which is we have shared sensing. Mm-hmm. So then there gets to be a shared basis of choice making. We can talk through and seeing pretty much the same shit. And if someone says, no, really, this thing is over there, we can just go look and check it out, right? So we evolved to believe our senses were giving us a good picture of the world. But it was a tiny little world, right? It was this very tiny geographic area, very tiny number of people that we were able to directly sense. So then we start getting telecommunications and I can see the news and I'm seeing stuff happening in all parts of the world. And I've never been to those parts. And I don't have a sense of what are all the other ways they could have filmed and viewed that and all the other perspectives and what's happening about it. And then there's way more total information than I can process. Then let's say I am watching police brutality videos and I'm on a YouTube channel that just curates police brutality videos. And I watch 100 of them. By the time I'm finished watching 100 of them in a row, or even 10 in a row, I haven't also watched a million interactions of police not being violent, right? So what I'm getting is a curation of a particular kind of thing where my sensing of the world is curated in a very specific way that is not statistically representative of the whole world. Mm-hmm. As a result, my blood is boiling and police are totally the enemy, right? And I have the sense, look, it's fucking universal, it's ubiquitous. This is the whole thing that happens. And I read the comments and everyone else thinks similarly because they're watching the same thing. So I feel like everybody knows, right? But then if I'm watching another one that's curated for people attacking police and the danger police are in and the heroism that they go through, I can have this completely opposite sense that is also not statistically representative. So for me to be able to look at the statistics, I got to say, what are all of the police, non-police interactions that happen? What percentage of them are heroic? What percentage are violent? Which percent are very low-grade violent, like just slightly assholish and abusive, or kind of low-grade heroic of them going above and beyond versus mostly just boring, right, interactions? And can I statistically average from all that anything that's insightful? But that's not what I get when I'm watching social media. I get an emotional flood of I'm having a direct sensory experience of the world, but it is cherry-picked to be non-statistically representative of the world. No one emotionally is immune to that outside of weird neurological disorders, like, weird kinds of emotional improcessing, lack of process disorders. So what that means is if you're receiving a curated view of the world, which you are, because there are no views of the world that are coming that aren't curated by somebody's agenda, then you're going to be having a sense that you understand the world, even though what you're getting is manipulated and not statistically representative. And you'll be having an emotional reaction that will both make you more certain than you should be, more outraged than you should be. And we'll just start with those, both more certain and more outraged, and probably more righteous or sanctimonious. And yet there will be people, just like the deer video from the deer side or the wolf side, right? The hunt video, there will be people whose view of the same issues is curated on the exact opposite side. Let's say we call it social justice and CRT or vaccines or whatever it is, who have just as much certainty, sanctimony, and outrage in the exact opposite direction. And everybody's wrong. Like there's little partial truth, but everybody is getting a view that has been curated more than is representative and is under nuanced. So yeah, it's super important to understand if you think you're immune to it, you are not, right? Like there are a number of us who have intentionally curated those experiments. And even while we know we're doing it to ourselves, we're being emotionally affected by it. So we're like, oh, fuck, there's a kind of humility I have to have because I am not immune to this.
Right. There seems like there's a way in which that can be actually used to our advantage ultimately, because what I sense is I sense that pressure creates adaptation. That's always the way it happens. You put pressure on one particular thing, adaptation arises. I've seen in my own social media feed, which is going through the same algorithms and which is used to hijacking extreme polarizing opinions. People are so used to that now. They've pressed that button so many times that when I come with I've created the idea, the concept united polarity, which is built upon shared reverence and an understanding of both sides. When I make those posts, they outperform all other posts that I do by like a 7x, 7x multiple. And I think the reason is that people are now, the pressure that we've felt from this polarization is actually creating the opportunity for this middle path, this third door to actually flourish. It's like it's gone to such an extreme that, we're not quite there yet. And I think, unfortunately, we may have to get even a little more extreme for actually it to take hold even more. But the pressure itself is creating this other desire, this deep craving for a balanced and nuanced conversation. Now, of course, there's selection bias. People who follow me, people who follow my podcast, more likely to engage with that. I understand. But nonetheless, just in my own audience, like those are the type of posts and discussions that people are really enjoying the most. And I think and when that happens, the algorithms will start feeding those more often, because if we understand that these algorithms are not actually trying to destroy the world, they're actually just trying to maximize profit and attention. So if profit and attention are actually going to a more nuanced perspective, well, they will guide and deliver that more nuanced perspective, that more shared reverence understanding. And so actually the same mechanism could be used to create this other, revolution of consciousness.
Okay, so the phenomena you're describing is that when there is a race to the bottom, at a certain point, it often creates the basis for a new race to the top. And that's what creates boom and bust cycles.
Right.
And this is kind of a well-known market idea. So I've got a bunch of whatever it is, fishermen that are all fishing in the same lake. Somebody figures out that there's a way of doing the fishing that is a little bit more polluting or a little bit more exploitive or whatever, but more profitable. They do it, then everybody else races to do the same thing more. Eventually the lake is so polluted and fucked up because of that race to the bottom that someone's starting to say, we don't do that thing and we do this clean thing. They can charge more for it because there's now a market basis for the organic or the free trade or the whatever, or there's now a market for water purification devices or something like that, right? So now you have some new niche because the badness of the race to the bottom created a new desire. Unfortunately, though, it's all still just based on how I can get ahead market dynamics, and there will keep being both, right? So then I start having some little bit of race to the top, and there still keeps being a good niche for race to the bottom. We have to close the race to the bottom niches. So it's like only once fast food had kind of gotten as much proliferation, fast food and junk food as it did, that you started getting ubiquitous obesity, did you start getting the diet industry emerging so much. But then you have big consumer goods companies that are selling diet products and fast food products in the same investment portfolio, right? And it's like, great, are you feasting or are you fasting? We'll sell both sides of that thing. And so, but if you have boom and bust cycles, right? You have race to the top and race to the bottom, but with exponentially growing tech, in an increasingly fragile world, the busts start to become things that you can't make it through, right? There's too much harm from them. And so we have to actually go a step better than that, because yes, some people will be really excited to get a more nuanced view that is not totally polarizing and weaponized. But that doesn't mean that there still won't be susceptibilities to push on particular views that get a lot of traction. And this is why, like the Occupy movement, you started to get like the Tea Party and the Green Party on the same side about something. We are the 99%. And it was like class issues are deeper than our other issues. It's like, whoa, that's a big fucking thing. And then the news cycle started to run stuff like, if I remember correctly, stuff about abortion rights and gun control and gay marriage. And boom, they just separated very quickly because you could find the cleaving lines and push on them. Now, what Facebook is a unbelievably powerful AI that finds all the cleaving lines and upregulates both sides of them, right? Because it's optimizing for engagement, and you end up getting the most engagement where people feel the most passion. They feel the most passion where they feel the most threat. And it was classic enemy hypothesis. This comes back to the redemptive violence, because a lot of those comments are some sublimated form of violence, right? And so then when you were getting to the culture topic, what you were getting to is, how do we evolve what people want? How do we evolve their basis for choice internally? Because the catastrophe side and the dystopia side, the catastrophe side is if people have access to increasing catastrophic power, and they are psychologically oriented that they would use that, then the people can't self-govern, right? And they have to be governed by something. It's too dangerous to let them self-govern. You can't just do some fully libertarian, whatever, they'll figure it all out, if the harm is not just that they kill somebody in the street, but that they release a bioweapon. So you're like, okay, no, when people have that much catastrophic capability, the libertarian ideas just become nonsense. So then if the answer is they have to be governed, well, who could have the power to govern all of that? And how would we possibly trust that thing? Now that thing becomes dystopic. Mm-hmm. Okay, fuck, we have to go back to how do we evolve to have something that is more libertarian work? And I'm not saying we go full libertarian, but to even have something where the people engage in institutions that have the ability, right? So there's both bottom-up libertarian type checks and institutional checks, but the institutions derive their power from the consent of the governed, and a governance subformed by the people. The people have to all care about each other's cares and be able to really sense make all of the stuff well. Otherwise, there's no capacity, no basis for it. The whole idea in a democracy was that these modern democracies emerging out of the Enlightenment was the idea that there was a patriotism as a binding, where I wasn't going to make my fellow countrymen the biggest enemy. Like, just not going to do that. And realize that compromise is better than war. And that we're only going to do that if I have enough respect for my fellow countrymen that I will really listen to their ideas, because I don't want to come up with something they hate so much they have to war with me. And so how do we respect each other enough to listen well enough to come up with strategies that can work for everybody, right? Yeah.
I think but I believe that in the same dynamic, I understand the cyclical nature of the race to the bottom creating the race to the top. But if the race to the top is the end game move, which is the anti-fragility, where you don't have cleaving lines anymore because you don't see yourself as separate. And that's the fundamental race to the top, is back to unicity, back to union. So you're actually becoming anti-fragile in that same capacity. And that top will not only reach a top, but potentially, theoretically, could reach the top and stick. Because if it's designed in the right way, the pressure that's pulling us apart then creates the desire for this other thing. But if it's steered in the right direction, and we've talked about how all of the great religions, reducing them to their mystical roots, not reducing them, but kind of filtering away all of the different power grabs that have happened over all of these years, and understanding that everybody's pointing to the similar thing. If we actually get back to that understanding, that is actually almost an invincible understanding. It's like, if you really get that, you're not going to be susceptible. You may still be in some small capacity, but it feels like that's the end game move that actually creates a race to the top of consciousness from which there is no retracement. There is no race back to the bottom, because you can't unsee and unfeel what you've already come to know. And everything relies on that old structure that's pulling you apart.
Okay, so let's explore this together. So when you say if the race to the top gets to be towards some kind of culture that has the ability to be a wise planetary culture, and because it's planetary, you don't have to keep having the selection for war on different sides, right? It can truly be not based on unifying against an enemy, where you still have all those multipolar trap things. Okay, well, you mentioned kind of unicity and oneness. We know this is part of it, but we also know this is not the whole thing. So it's actually we're not going to get into what is the full mimetic payload that is necessary and sufficient for an enlightened culture, but we'll start. because you've had experiences in nature and in meditation and on psychedelics of some profound sense of interconnectivity with everything, right? That love thy neighbor as thyself wasn't love your neighbor as much as yourself, but as an expression of consciousness, that there is some sameness of the consciousness in the eyes you're looking at, right? At the same time, you come out of those peak experiences that you can't stay in, and you don't want to share your bed with every single human and all the homeless people in Austin. And you don't want to share your clothes and all your shit with them, right? And so there is a basis at which if they were trying to really kind of aggressively push that you did share all your shit, you'd knock the person out and be like, no.
Yeah.
So you're like, okay, wait, I don't believe in oneness perfectly. I don't experience it. I experience being an individual who wants some shit individually and has a differential orientation to my own experience relative to the experience of others. Now, how do I hold those together? Because if I try to pretend that there is no real deep basis of the individuality, it'll just become a pathological shadow. We'll all bullshit about oneness and yet still want our partner to be sexual just with us and not with anyone else, and want some of our stuff to ourselves. And we'll share the stuff we want to share, but we don't want to share everything. So we have to be able to say, what is the right relationship to the individuality as well as the oneness, to the difference as well as the sameness, right? That has to be part of that mimetic package. Otherwise, it's just a fail case of it.
Right. And the metaphor I use for that, for holding those boundaries, is the rose. Like the rose, which gives its scent and its flower and its beauty to the world, also has thorns. And the thorns don't go out seeking other people to attack and whip and punish and whatever, but it holds its boundary. And because the boundary is necessary so that it doesn't get trampled, so that the flower, its love, its consciousness, doesn't get trampled, the bush doesn't die because something just comes and mows right through it. I mean, obviously machines can and whatever, but the metaphor is that it carries the thorns to protect itself, but also offers its love universally, which is through its scent. And so I think these kind of metaphors and these ideas need to be held, where because we are a multidimensional being. We are both individual and same. It depends on, and both are true, and it's a paradox, but that's the paradox of being multidimensional, as we are, going all the way back to source and oneness, and all the way as far as we are now in separation, both being very real. And I think so that has to become a part of the story, as you correctly pointed out. Like, we have to tell a more nuanced story than this, we're all one. Well, that's of course not true. It's only part of the story. But that part of the story is the neglected part of the story, which needs to be brought back into balance with the individualism, which we got that shit down. We understand that, we got a pretty good idea of our individualism, but it's our interconnectedness and shared reverence and shared commonality and unicity that we don't get. And there will be some perhaps that'll go full Jesus and be able to go all the way into that, dimensional reality where they're just seeing the unicity, but it is very important to not pretend to be Jesus. It's great to be Jesus if you're Jesus, but don't pretend to be Jesus, because then you're just, in your spiritual bypass and you're actually bullshitting yourself and it's not actually real. And again, you're living out your own shadow. So it is definitely a more nuanced story than that, but I think I point to the one side because that one side is just grossly neglected and underrepresented compared to the individualism story.
Okay, this is a really fun and fertile place. So when you say if one's experience authentically is Jesus-like, cool. So if you notice, most of the monastic traditions of the world had vows of poverty and chastity. And there was a reason they had vows of poverty and chastity. As we just said, the things you have a hard time sharing is your physical stuff and your sex partners, right? Yes. And because evolution selected for survival and mating. And so there's a very strong desire to get stuff that enables survival and to get stuff that enables mate selection. And interestingly, in humans, having more stuff than the other guy there's no upper bound to how much that stays relevant to mate selection, right? My 250-foot super yacht no longer seems as good when the 300-foot super yacht pulls in. And so there is no upper bound on the amount of resource, even though there is for survival. So both the survival impetus and the mate signaling impetus create a competitive basis that drives this thing that we're talking about.
Right.
Violence thing happens. So you're not going to own anything. You'll just live in the monastery, and you're not going to mate, and you're not going to have kids that have you more focused on your own progeny than focused on the good of everyone. That was the idea in so many of the monastic traditions. And usually even further, you're going to shave your head, right? And either like the Buddhists shave it fully, or like the friars shave just the top so it looks maximally goofy as an ego damage. So that you are maximally not connected to the individual, either your own genetic progeny, your aesthetics, your anything else, your stuff. Well, we see that didn't even work in monasticism all that well, right? And definitely not outside of it. And so, okay, so it's important to recognize that these beings genetically did evolve where mate signaling and survival were very real impetuses that are coded into the structure of our neurology and endocrinology. So we have to deal with those impulses, right? We have to have an enlightened way, a more enlightened way of dealing with them. And they're not oneness oriented, because I can survive and you die if there's not enough resource. And I can mate and you not mate, right? Like really physically, there is a differential basis there. And yet when I multiply that, not just by we're going to fight with our fists over who gets to get the food or get the mating opportunity, but we're going to fight within weapons and then up to nukes, that same impulse multiplied by technology destroys everything. There's a lot of people get stuck on this, like, wait, what is the fucking cause of all the problems in the world? Is it capitalism? But the USSR seemed to have a lot of problems, and that wasn't capitalism. It's something like competition. But wait, competition seems to actually drive evolution in nature. Why is competition good for nature and not for us? But in sports, it seems like it's kind of good in terms of developing certain things. Unbounded competition multiplied by tech is different than competition not multiplied by tech. Mm-hmm. Different in kind. In the evolutionary process, where the lions are fighting for alpha lion mating status or whatever it is, to select for the genes that are best for lions as a whole, there is a symmetry between all the lions where the difference is tiny, and that's what's being selected for. And not just lion to lion, but also lion to deer that they're chasing. The deer gets away more often than the lion catches it, right? So there is a symmetry in the power in all of those types of dynamics, which is why we have weight classes. You and I talked about this before. The idea that, like, okay, we're going to show up to the boxing ring, but you show up as you and I show up with an Apache helicopter. Like that's not an interesting competition to see who has better skills, right?
The Romans might have been interested in it, but yeah.
Not from the point of view of competition and selection, just from the point of view of enjoying cruelty. And spectacle. But so the thing with technology is that we can have our competition drives arms races, right? So if we want to compete, but we go from just having a little bit more stuff to needing larger super yachts, and there's no upper boundary on that mate signaling kind of thing. And then also not just us, but nation states, which are these weird fictions, or major corporations. And they have to keep evolving the tooling to compete. And they're competing on a single metric, but they're externalizing harm to other metrics. If you get unbounded competition, driving arms races, competing for narrow metrics, externalizing harm for others, that system self-terminates on a finite planet. Mm-hmm. And yet the impulse to do that thing is coded in us.
Yeah.
And we have to deal with that.
This is really shaking this is really important, because I could suppose that if I could transfer my understanding of the world to everybody at once, and not saying that this is moral or desirable or any of those sorts of things, but I could hypothesize prior to this discussion, like people would be a lot cooler to each other. And I believe that to be fundamentally true. However, if everybody was an Aubrey, I understand my own sexual desire and my desire to win. I'm a competitive person. I enjoy the finite games but I also have a deep understanding of the infinite game, but I'm still compelled within the finite game because of my deep, deep lure and draw to sexual experience. I'm very satisfied with my beautiful wife, Ilana, which I'm glad you got a chance to meet. And I'm in a great spot there, but all of the other Aubreys would be looking at, the different Aubreys and being like, how do I get what that fucking Aubrey has? And so it wouldn't necessarily ultimately solve the problem of a finite world with the infinite opportunity to accumulate and compete.
So now let's say now let's say that this other asshole, Aubrey, he's an asshole just because he got some head injury, right? Stuff happens, even if you try and get culture well. He wants to do whatever he can underhandedly to take Philana, right? And so now you got to actually try to protect. now you create a security service, but he also is doing well. He's got a lot of money, so he's creating a more advanced attack service. Now you have the beginning of fiefdoms that have to put more and more of their resources into the military process to compete over the scarce resource.
Yeah.
Right.
And I would go to the fucking bitter end. I would go to the bit if it came to protecting my Vailana. I would go to the bitter end. I would get all the cans of proverbial spinach to make sure I was fucking Popeye and that Bruno did not succeed in raping my olive oil.
And if every step that you make, he's making a comparable step, you're going to try to innovate how to do fundamentally better types of steps, right? You're going to try to innovate. Okay, well, my security forces in symmetry with his are problematic. I want to go asymmetric in the competition. So let me see if I can get a helicopter in here, an Air Force to deal with his ground force. Let me see if I can get some fucking surveillance on his team or whatever it is, right? And so you can see how an arms race happens.
Yep.
And then you start to say, well, why just wait for the fucker to attack me? If I know he's going to, the best defense is an offense. I should just preemptively defend myself, right? Which is an offense. But then he knows that. So then you see how the world gets to where it is.
Yeah.
And now what we're getting to
with a finite number of Vailanas and an infinite number of Aubreys, we're in a very dangerous world. That's a fundamental truth.
And let's say that there's some really beautiful spot on the Austin Lake that you want to live on, and it's right on a cliff, and there's just one of them. There's not lots of other cliff sites quite like that one. Somebody else wants the same place, right? And you kind of want for other people, so long as they don't want the exact thing that you have, because you don't want to share that thing, and there's a finite number of them. And so all of a sudden, our oneness-oriented empathy decreases radically, and our individual-oriented desire to win increases radically.
Right.
And so then it becomes that it's not just Aubrey with this, but Aubrey creates a relationship with a bunch of other people around, because this is happening now at a tribal level. It's not just you having that point and you having that woman, but it's you and everybody you know having the chance to have any women and not all be slaughtered by these other fuckers coming in, where you and all your friends all decide to unify to create a military to deal with that. And then some of the other tribes actually unify to be larger. Now you got to unify with some other tribes and start doing politics to be larger. And you end up you go from tribes to chiefdoms to fiefdoms and kingdoms to nation states to global economic trading blocks to, you get this fucking thing, right? Mm-hmm. And yet this thing self-terminates, right? Because the thing that wins at the tribal warfare scale kills everything at the global scale. And so we're at a place where what has been selected for selects itself out of existence soon. And our ability to understand that and consciously select something different is kind of the only path, but it's not a really simple one. Now, this is where we actually have to get not just the oneness, but the individuality, and what is the right ethics around that? Because we haven't got individuality well. Because our models of it are almost exclusively competitive more than synergistic. And so where I'm the same as others gives me some basis for empathy, but where we have differences, how do we relate to that in a more healthy and enlightened ways has to be just as important a part of the new religion or new philosophy or ethos. A friend who I believe you just met, Mark Gaffney, he has this whole rabbinic thing on the unique self, which is a big part of the kind of Kabbalistic tradition so it's not just Buddhist oneness, and we can all kind of meditate into that oneness, because the moment you leave the meditation, that's not where you're at anymore, right? And that's not the whole story. That's a part of the story, but there's also that oneness embodied and incarnated in unique ways. And so then, is there a way to be able to hold the difference where there is a uniqueness to you and what you can experience and what you can offer, but where that uniqueness, if you and me are both actually unique, we can't compete on the same metrics. Right? Yeah. If I say that we can compete, we're a function of our of our money and the size of our cocks and our whatever it is for our mate selection thing. And there's like 4 things we can compete on those and who's a better package. That's actually not uniqueness. That's sameness, right? That's the sameness of a few metrics of selection. At the heart of when you fall in love with someone deeply is something ineffable. It's unspeakable. That is beyond a package, right? There is a taste or a quality of the uniqueness of the thing that you have a relationship with. And so if there is something where the difference of everyone actually has a uniqueness that has the interconnectedness, the quality of oneness, but with a totally unique form to it, then those unique forms can't fundamentally compete. There's no metric to measure or assess it on. And then you can offer something to the world that is different than what I can offer to the world, but where the world is better at my own assessment if you offer it fully.
It seems like still, though, there's the issue of finite resources. But I think the solution that I can see with that is we often think that we want things, but we don't really want the things. We want the sensations that the things give us, right? Like that's really what we're chasing. We don't want necessarily the car or the bank account or the place in the lake. We want the feeling of what that brings to us, the feeling of awe, perhaps when we look out at the view, the feeling of power and self-worth and validation from the things that we accomplish. We want the feeling of love that our sweetheart gives us. We really want feelings. So it seems like in order to get beyond the necessity to compete over things is to break down the myth that it's actually the things we want and say, no, you don't actually want the things. You want the sensations that the things give you, but there's a way to get those sensations without the things. And that's like a deep, deep spiritual kind of practice that would be required to train everybody how to get sensations without the things that are giving them the kind of quick hit of the sensation that they're chasing.
Well, here's a real easy answer. It's already underway. Just hook everybody up with their Oculus to the metaverse. And in the metaverse with Oculus, and Oculus will progressively turn into a matrix boot, right? I can give anybody any feelings that they want, and there's no scarcity of resources because it's all digitally created simulation.
Well, that's on the hypothesis that there are some feelings that are reducible and replicable by a machine universe, which I think for those of us who've experienced the numinous like you and I, we believe fundamentally as a tenet of faith that there is something that's irreducible. You know, I'm wearing this little toad necklace around my neck. I fucking guarantee you that, well, I don't guarantee you, I don't know anything for that sure, that's certain, but I'm fairly confident that you're not going to get a Bufo journey in the metaverse. You're not gonna be able to duplicate this feeling, which is pure love, God. There's no other real way that I have to describe it, right? So I think there may be some sensations that we could get by jacking ourselves into it, but some that may not be even possible by, and not replicable in the machine world, and perhaps love itself, even in the more mundane sense, rather than the psychedelic, rocket ship sense, is not reducible to that, nor is the feeling of awe, nor is the feeling of that deep kind of enlivening peace that you get in the meditative state. Maybe if you can alter your brainwave chemistry and some things can happen, it's possible. But I feel like there's things that are irreducible, and I don't know. That's just like a feeling that I have. But maybe I'm underestimating what technology could potentially offer.
So let's say that in addition to the Oculus and visual, auditory, haptic input, and of course, as soon as I go 3, I start 3 different axes of input: visual, auditory, haptic. I start getting the ability to simulate immersive experience in the brain pretty deeply. But let's say we start to figure out how to add chemistry to it. We already know there are a lot of people, and the thing with the heroin addiction is someone is going for a particular kind of sensation, independent, decoupled from what evolutionarily would have given them that sensation, right? Like, why do I even have receptor sites for heroin? Well, because natural opiates do emerge in certain kinds of processes. In the same way that, like, if I'm doing the meth and I'm getting the dopamine or the cocaine, Dopamine is naturally produced, but it's naturally produced in association with things that had evolutionary relevance, right? But if I can couple them and just get the sensation without the other thing, that is almost always destructive, because the thing that wasn't the sensation was actually part of what was fundamentally meaningful, right? The sensation was just a part of it, which is why in the simulation story, if I could simulate it better, I can use transcranial magnetic stimulation on the right hemisphere to induce God experiences and whatever. And I know that I'm in that simulation. Do I want to blue pill and just jack back in and have the thing? Or do I want a red pill because there's some connection to reality that is meaningful for me beyond just the sensation of it? It's a very important question.
It is an important question. It seems like that actually the synergy, it seems like while people are pushing against this technology, it could actually be a useful part of the solution, where people all of a sudden, when they realize that they can get a lot of the sensations they are craving in a unlimited virtual universe, where that sensation is, universally, ubiquitously available to them, then it may actually decrease some of this competitive individualism, which is, actively seeking to take from this finite world. It could be productive in some ways, I suppose. I suppose this could be a part of this multifaceted solution, is in kind of helping to tame our baser instincts.
Now, it depends upon what it is being developed for, right? Because, like, let's say we look at the heroin in the McDonald's. If the thing that is guiding the development of the tech, whether it's food tech or pharma tech or whatever, if the thing that's guiding it is a market process, then, and I can offer people sensations that they want. In fact, sensations that then they want so much they get addicted to. Driving addiction is the best thing I can do from a business point of view, because I want to maximize lifetime revenue of a customer. And I maximize lifetime revenue by driving addiction, and ideally starting the addiction as young as possible. And then expanding the addiction to the largest number of people possible. Now, if you think about this nonsense idea in the market that demand is, like, when I say nonsense, there's an Adam Smith idealized market where people want real things that will really enrich the quality of their life. And then wanting that and being willing to give something to it creates a basis for supply. And the rational actors here will choose the supply that is the best product or service at the best price. So people's desire creates a basis for healthy innovation, and the whole world gets better. Except that the supply side becomes coordinated in a way the demand side doesn't. There isn't all customers working together in some customer union against Nike or Google, right? But Nike or Google is actually a company that is highly coordinated. And the supply side starts to realize, we've supplied the shit people want, but now we'll make more money if we can get them to want shit they don't currently want. So how do we change the style every year so people need to keep getting new shit? How do we either do designed obsolescence or perceived obsolescence or addiction driving so that we can manufacture demand artificially, right? The entire idea of the intelligence of markets dies with that, with manufactured demand and supply side drive in that way. And now it's just a self-authoring extraction machine on the way to self-termination on a finite planet. So if the thing that can provide the experience, because there's no question when you're eating the Hostess, you're having an experience that is of a different nature of the total amount of dopamine than when you're eating a salad. Or, whatever. They figured out how to extract salt, fat, sugar, and combine them in the ways that maximize that dopaminergic hit. And the same is true with whatever, the porn and lots of things. So in the metaverse, if it is continuing to have the technology developed by supply side that wants to optimize for manufacturing demand, which will appeal to the lowest angels of people's nature, no, that becomes a dystopian hell. Mm-hmm. What would the tech be that was actually healthy, where we say, how do we ensure that when someone straps an Oculus on, it's not creating such hypernormal stimuli that it makes people have a shittier experience out here because it's desensitized them to normal stimuli, because every girl in there is AI Instagrammed and AI airbrushed and shit. So now all normal girls are not pretty and whatever it is. And my avatar in there is so dope that I don't want to be this avatar out here. And so let's say that one of the criteria of the digital world has to be that it increases the quality of life in the non-virtual world. Well, then it could be a really awesome tool, but who the fuck builds that thing? Because it's not going to be a market-driven process.
Well, it would have to come from the pressure of the world not being optimized, almost getting enough destruction that actually there's the motivation to do it. It almost feels like there needs, and I pray that this is as gentle as possible, but it feels like the necessity for things to fall apart a little bit to shake people out of this reality that we can continue on the path is almost necessary for people to actually start making the choices and build a new ethics that isn't bound to some, white bearded God who's going to punish you if you don't do this, or if you do this or whatever. But it's built on this, again, mutually assured destruction, like where people really understand that this path is actually going to destroy the world, not only for you, but for your children, and everything is going to degrade. So we must make a different choice. But it feels like a little bit of pressure might be actually what's needed to kind of raise that level of consciousness and actually allow ethics to bind people to their desires.
So I want to comment first on something really brilliant about the white beard God thing. Independent of whether whatever was problematic about it or whether it's true or not, just like a functional thing that it did. And basically any system of heaven and hell or reincarnation were able to do this, which is a perfected system of justice for self-organization. So let's say that we have not got people to deeply empathize with other people's experience and really care about their experience independent of how it affects their own experience. And they're still mostly just selfish fucks who care about their own experience. And there are ways that they could hurt other people and get away with it because they can hide it. They can pretend they didn't do it. They can whatever it is. Systems of actual justice are tricky because you got to have policing and court systems and jails, and it's expensive, and people still can get away with stuff. They can figure out how to hide it. But an invisible watcher that sees absolutely everything, and not one jot, not one tittle shall go unnoticed before the day of judgment, and that kind of thing, that also is an absolute perfected authority. So there is no appeal. And with infinite reward and infinite punishment, it's really just like the zenith of behavior mod, right? What would the best reward be? Well, eternity of everything awesome. And what would the worst punishment be? Eternity of everything terrible, absolute authority and absolute surveillance. But it also sees your thoughts, right? Not just even your actions. And you can go to hell for the wrong types of thoughts. So now and forever is so much longer than a short little time here. Even if you're just selfishly oriented to not burn in hell and to have a good heaven, or to not have a shitty reincarnation and to have a good reincarnation, you're still oriented to do whatever the moral things in that belief system are, because it's all being seen and there's going to be consequence, positive or negative, for all of it. Like, that's kind of awesome, actually, from the point of view of how do we get a whole big group of people to follow some kind of code when it's very hard to enforce them, and where you have not yet necessarily figured out how to have them all care about everyone authentically. How do you bind that caring about their own experience requires doing the virtuous thing? And so, like, we're really missing a lot without something like that.
So this is interesting because, all right, so I grew up and I was in a pretty much atheist leaning agnostic family, and, Jewish by heritage and genetics, but not really practicing. Kind of phoned in a Hanukkah when my grandma was around, and did Christmas too, because it was fun. And then moved to Texas. It's much more Christian. And I saw people racked with a lot of guilt. I saw a lot of things happening with my friends and peers, like people's first sexual experiences being incredibly traumatic. And I was like, what is going on? Like, this is some craziness. And then move along. I go take a trip to Italy. I go to the dungeons of the Inquisition, which was in one of the cities in Italy. And it was one of the most horrifying things that I've ever witnessed in my life. And then I started getting very anti-religious. Right. And so atheist to the point of crusading to be anti-religious. Like I have to dismantle all of this superstition that's caused all this harm and is continuing to cause harm that I'm seeing in my peers. Okay, fast forward, I go do my first, guided medicine journey, combination of MDMA and psilocybin in the mountains of New Mexico. I feel my body evaporate. This thing that emerges, which is consciousness, or I could call it a soul. That was really the only name that I could say. What is this thing, this unborn, undying aspect of self? And then what I ultimately realized was that there is a recapitulation of all of your actions and deeds and thoughts that happens with the perfect unblinded clarity of seeing yourself without all of the delusional, projective, rationalizations and notions that we have that get us to do all of these things that are sometimes blindingly pernicious, ways in which I treated girlfriends and different things. I mean, I was never like bad, quotes, but I'd done things that were selfish for sure. And I just had to look at those like somebody had, things that were holding my eyes open and I couldn't look away from them. And that feeling was akin to hell.
Yeah.
And then the forgiveness of that was then the redemption and then the feeling of heaven, which was waiting. And so I had this real interesting moment where I was like, wow, the story isn't that far off, in that there will come a reckoning where we have to look with perfect clarity at all of our deeds and actions. And that will be a hell if we've lived a life in ignorance or in denial of, some of these real morals. And it will be a heaven and a celebration when we get to release this physical form and experience the divinity of these other dimensional realities. And then another layer, which has recently come into my awareness, is that moment when you actually do it, because I was just pretend doing it with the psychedelics, right? I got to like touch it and taste it partially, but not completely. Well, that moment, you're outside of the bounds of time. And this is, of course, predicated upon a multidimensional understanding of our existence, and that these dimensions are not bound by time. So in a place that's not bound by time, what could be a moment is also infinity. There's no difference between a moment of this recapitulation of like, wow, what did I do? I can't believe I did. I'm feeling all of that guilt and the pain and the empathy for everything that you've done. That stretches to infinity also, and is also a moment, depending on how long it goes. So interestingly, there was in my very first experience 22 years ago, there was a synergy that I've never really thought about the importance of this, but it's coming to light now, like, wow, maybe that's actually really important to recognize and highlight, that this is a way to maybe potentially bind our own ethics, is to understand that yes, there is a hell and there is a heaven, and it's us that's the judge, and it's the truest, fairest judge because it knows not only our actions, but our intentions, and it knows the truth of all things. It's aware of, it's not blinded by the stories and the indoctrinations of cultures. It's really bound to the truth, and it's us lifted from all of our delusions. So I guess that's one way of saying that potentially this is reality in some just slightly different way. And maybe that is an important piece to this puzzle, is to bring this awareness back.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting when you're in that experience, you're reviewing all of your actions, you're seeing them. So that the space of that experience is that kind of review and judgment, right? And the reward and punishment, whatever, are in that space. When we talk about, but what's interesting is there's a transparency. Someone is forced to see themselves on the Ibogaine journey in a way that they aren't most of the time.
Right.
And so this is that whole thing of like, what is the basis of the kind of behavioral upgrade of people if there is no transparency? What's the basis of justice? You don't have justice if you can hide the effect of the action, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of transparency required for justice, which is required for the kind of cause and effect that motivates behavior to move in the right direction. And so the psychedelic or the self-reckoning experience is one way of that. the idea of a sky god who sees everything and will, punish or reward is another. The sky god had to come when we moved from a small tribal scale to a much larger scale. At the tribal scale, literally the tribe saw everything because it was a small enough scale you couldn't fucking hide anything. Mm-hmm. And it's actually interesting to think about for the vast majority of human history and all of our evolved history, these small little tribes of less than 150 people, you could never effectively lie and get away with it because everybody's gossiping about everything. Everybody's talking, everybody's seeing everything. And you couldn't like hide the pollution somewhere or like make a mess and get like literally the tiny scale created a forced transparency where what was good for the individual and what was good for the tribe became bound. Right? You weren't going to get ahead by fucking the tribe over. It just wasn't going to happen. If you tried, you'd get exiled and then you die. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to note that our whole, individual humans weren't selected for. Individual humans would die. Tribes were selected for, but they were at a big enough scale they could deal with bears and the cold, but they were at a small enough scale that what was good for the individual and what was good for the tribe as a whole was bound because of the forced transparency, the forced cause and effect. And so as soon as we needed to get much beyond a tribal scale where I could actually do something where I could leave a mess somewhere and hide and nobody would know who it was, or I could fuck somebody else over or whatever, now I needed a sky god, right? Because as soon as you start to get to the empire scale, now either you have to have some king that's rewarding and punishing everyone, which you'd have as well, but it's hard. You have to whip a lot of people and monitor a lot of people and whatever, or you have that king as below the same as above, and you have some kind of religious idea. But it's now the thing that you're noticing with the psychedelic experience is, okay, can we self-police, right? Can we where our own sense of I couldn't actually be fulfilled. I couldn't actually respect myself because I'm monitoring there's a mindfulness, there's a monitoring, and I actually have my own sense of ethics that are deep enough that is a directing and a binding force for my own behavior. Mm-hmm. And then the question is, through the combination of both numinous experiences and ethical development and cognitive and mindfulness development, can we develop people where they don't need a sky god and they don't necessarily even need a tribe to have internalized that type of function?
It seems like, you mentioned Iboga, and my first Bwiti shaman that, I spoke to, and perhaps there's different variations of the initiation tradition, but it's a very heavy dose of Iboga. And what he described is they would have somebody look into a mirror for like the duration of 24 hours or some obscenely long amount of time, where instead of gazing out at nature or wearing a blindfold, you're looking at a mirror and You're looking back at yourself. And that was the initiation of like, with this clarity that, Iboga is bringing you, looking into the mirror so you can't escape seeing yourself. This was the initiation that actually allowed the other people in the tribe to be able to trust you.
Now let's come back to all those other Aubreys, right? That conflict theory world, but where you're having that experience looking in the mirror on Iboga regularly. It starts to, you see that there is one, you see where the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other shoulder image came from, right? And that there is a certain kind of lower angels of our nature that really just has to do with survival and mate signaling and the desire to do better than the other guy at that. And there's also then a higher angels of our nature where there are ways that I can do better than the other guy where I can't actually be at peace with who I am.
Right.
And then specifically the pressure that you mentioned, not only can I not be at peace with who I am, I realize that the other guy trying to do that as well, and us escalating actually ruins everything for everybody. And so I'm now bound to try to help that guy in a way where we can find a better solution, because there is no good, I don't just win the war once and for all. I win the battle and engender more enmity and a counterattack, and then all of our energies in this thing. So it's like, okay, ultimately I have to find a better way for all of us, because they don't plan it. Mm-hmm. And so now we take the heaven and hell mythopoetics and actually bring it back to something pretty literal. One way I like to think of the rapture story is, and this is not the only right way to think about it, as you mentioned, you can have your own rapture experience in deep meditation or on Iboga looking in a mirror, right? But the rapture story of the end is nigh. This phase is coming to an end. There's going to be a great time of judgment. There's going to be a purgatory where we have a chance to reconcile and rectify the wickedness of our ways. And if so, we get some much better thing, heaven on earth, or the reinstatement of the garden or whatever. Or if not, we get hell or death or some kind of bad thing. There's kind of a hard fork, and there's like a purgatory choice hard fork thing. I think we're facing something that is very much like that, kind of literally, which is, we've been kind of shitty stewards of power for a long time. We've used our power to extinct other species, destroy ecosystems, destroy other cultures, and oppress people of lower classes. We've done some good stuff with it. We've been a very mixed bag, but the mixed bag that we are has used power destructively enough that, and it's continued to select for better coordination and construction, but also destruction capacities. That with the arms race of that continuing to exponential tech, if you continue to be equally shitty stewards of power with exponential tech, everything blows up. You ruin the planet, and you have wars that nobody wins and can make it through. And so either we continue to be humans like the humans we have been, and the thing self-terminates, or we are getting so much power through the technology we've created, we are forced to become good stewards of that power so we don't destroy ourselves. And good stewards of that power means, what does it mean to be a good steward of power itself? And power means the ability to influence, affect, control others, right? Other humans and other non-human life. So what does it mean to be a good steward of those types of capacities? So what is the wisdom, love, values, prudence that would guide that? Either we have to step up into that kind of planetarily to safely steward the power, or we destroy ourselves with it. That's very much a rapture story. And I imagine, like, there's an atheistic version of it, which is just philosophically oriented people, social philosophers in the Bronze Age, at the end of a war, seeing all of the dead people that were killed at a much greater distance than before we had the whatever the new weapon was, the crossbows or the whatever thing. And a large area of desert that used to be forest because we got better axes and better saws and whatever as the technology was increasing. They could just sit there and think, we keep building better tech and we're about to move from the Bronze into the Iron Age, and we keep destroying nature and killing each other better with it. We don't get to do that forever. Like, at a certain point, you can't destroy all the nature and kill, at that full scale. So this phase is coming to an end, and there's a wickedness of our ways and how we deal with power that has to be reconciled. And either we get it and we get this garden or not. Like, to me, that story, and very much like the Kali Yuga to Satya Yuga Hindu story or the end of the Mayan calendar, like they're just decent forecasting of the nature of continued technological power. If it is driven by the lower angels of our nature, it self-terminates. And so if that power continues, it forces the higher nature angels of our nature to become the basis of culture, or we self-terminate. Like, that's the forcing function.
Yep. And it, going back to what I was saying earlier, unfortunately, as much as I would like to hope and pray for and I still do, this very smooth transition, this awakening that happens without the necessity for massive disruption. And I still will hold that prayer, and I will, and I'll add to that prayer with my own belief that is a possibility. And I don't know exactly how. It seems, from my understanding of what is most likely, is that there is going to need to be a little bit of discomfort, a little bit of pain that we probably feel, that actually propels us into taking these threats really seriously. Because climate change, it's a couple degrees hotter here. It's not, and it's like, yeah, okay, we kind of understand it, but until we run out of water, or until it's so hot that people are dying and like shit's getting really gnarly, are we really going to take it that seriously enough? And I hope so, and I pray so, and I pray that this happens gradually, and we wake up with great speed and awareness that happens remarkably. And I think with the psychedelic renaissance, there are factors that are coming into play that can accelerate things beyond what the normal capacity is. But it just feels like, all right, we might need to prepare ourselves for a little bit of a bumpy road here, that's actually necessary for us to make it through to the other side.
Let's think about this for a minute. We already just went through a year and a half or so of people largely being on lockdown, let alone what happened in Nigeria and so many other places, much more violently as a result of effects of COVID and COVID response, supply chain dynamics, whatever else. We talk about, are we going to need some pain to come in climate change? Well, it's probably the case that climate change was the cause of the droughts in Syria that made all the subsistence farmers who had been there for such a long time no longer able to farm. So they moved to the cities, that led to resource pressures, that led to the war there, that already pretty much destroyed what the quality of life in Syria was, and almost brought about a fully armed conflict between the West and Russia, right on the border. Mm-hmm. And we don't have to talk about the planet getting so hot that no one can live on it to talk about heat waves in areas that destroy crops, in areas where there's food instability. So you have a huge population in India and in Bangladesh sharing watersheds with huge populations on either side, on China on one side, Pakistan on the other side. The water's running out of those watersheds. The heat waves in the summer are increasing. The supplies of food decreased during COVID because there was food shock that occurred because of not having fertilizer and things because of the shutdown of transportation. So the 50 plus Celsius heat waves that are anticipated over the next few summers, like, we already had enough refugees that nowhere wants refugees anymore. So what happens when the next chunk of refugees that are much larger in number than the previous ones came, because people don't just die peacefully, and you have very tense political fault lines? So the heat wave turns into human migration, turns into resource wars, can very easily turn into escalating large-scale wars. We're in a situation where being able to say we need some pain, like, it's already happening, basically. Depending upon where you are in the world, it's already happening.
So then we need greater awareness of the pain. And
it can escalate so fast that it goes from like, oh shit, that's really here, to, oh fuck, there's nothing we can do about it anymore.
Too late.
Now we're in large-scale war. And so we need greater awareness and greater action and responsibility coupled to that. And it's like, most people will either be stasis oriented or just personal pursuit oriented unless pain pushes growth. Teilhard de Chardin, the Catholic theologian who kind of, after Darwin, started incorporating evolutionary theory into Catholic theology. If you haven't read him, you'd really love Teilhard de Chardin. Mm-hmm. But he talked about, rather than a creator agent God, relating to the creative impulse God that moves everything towards more elegantly ordered complexity and more capability and beauty. And that evolutionary process brought about humans that have enough complexity to think about the evolutionary process, to feel all about it, and to decide to consciously help mediate it, so that rather than just being parts of the whole, we could step up into being agents for wholeness itself. And what would it mean to be local agents for wholeness, consciously aware of all that? And he talked about what he called the lure of becoming. Rather than have to be pushed by pain, because otherwise we're stasis oriented, we understand the inexorability and beauty of evolution. And we are drawn to become more, and not just in service of self, but in service of all that we wouldn't exist without. And this is the interconnectivity part of what you were mentioning, is as soon as I realized that without plants, I don't exist, there's no atmosphere, I'm dead. So an idea of myself separate from plants is nonsense. And without soil, bacteria, and microorganisms, plants don't exist. So I can't even define myself without plants and bacteria and fungus in a cogent way, because I wouldn't exist. But also without all of the people who make all the shit that my life depends upon, where my identity actually is wrapped up in all this stuff. So I'm like, well, my sense of myself as a separate thing is only because I take for granted the rest of the universe I depend upon. But if I said that which is required for me to exist has to be included in my definition of self, then my impulse of becoming is bound to the support of all of that, right? Now, this is interesting because someone can have the mushroom experience of oneness, but not also have the cognitive model of how all that works. And together, both the experience and the understanding of it, and then the understanding of, okay, there is individuality, but even when we're talking about individuality as opposed to oneness, there's interconnectivity across the differences, right? There's things that are not me in the individual sense, but that I depend upon and that create a world that either I don't exist without or that I want to see. So yeah, there's no question that pain can drive evolution, but we need to depend upon pain to drive it less and proactively be pursuing it in the awareness of the total imminent amount of pain that will come otherwise more. Mm-hmm. Because especially in a world where so many people are on painkillers and anti-anxiety meds and anti-emotional pain meds and whatever else, and all the other forms of distraction from their own inner pain through social media and porn and dating and whatever else it is, like pain doesn't even have the same effect. Right? We've done everything.
So we arrive at a place where we need to have a little bit of faith in this divine creative process that is going to awaken in a way that's stronger than what we've seen prior. And again, as I said, I think the psychedelic renaissance is potentially incalculable variable that can assist in this. But the optimism that, to go back to where we're coming from, the optimism is not a knowledge of exactly how it's going to go, but requires some faith. Like there is this thing which is true, which is an interconnectedness and an understanding of that, and this creative drive to protect and support the whole, and the better nature that we have latent and nascent within all of us, and to have a bit of faith that can awaken, and potentially that, the awareness of some of the pain could actually facilitate this. Let's pray for as little as possible and as much on the affirmative side of the awakening of this divine creation impulse.
And it's interesting, one of the reasons that I think people take all of the painkillers, whether it's the SSRI version or the benzo version or the opiate version or the alcohol version, is because they don't pain as a signal that something is off. They don't know what to do about it, right? They don't feel like they can do anything about it. So just numbing it is the best thing, which then allows us to keep doing the fucked up thing. If I put my hand in the fire, the pain is an evolutionary signal for me to pull my hand out of the fire. If I take morphine, I can let my hand keep burning off. So much of the psychological pain we feel is because we're living in ways that are really not meaningful and not fulfilling. Mm-hmm. And so as to be able to keep going and doing the cubicle job or whatever the thing is that I'm unfulfilled by, now I'm going to numb out the pain of the fact that my life sucks so that I can keep doing that thing. I want people, I want to actually feel the pain, but I want to be able to have an empowered relationship to it, right? So I'm not just broken, but I'm taking it as a signal to then be able to say, what is this a signal that needs corrected? And then what agency do I have to be able to actually correct it and move in the right direction? And not just my individual pain, but also the collective pain. There's only so much I can do about the collective pain if I'm bypassing my own, right? Because I've got to actually be able to feel it. So what do I have to clean it up and fix and address in my own life to then be able to feel more of the larger pain to then be able to do something about it? And I think this comes back to the sense of faith that you were talking about. You talk about faith and optimism in empowered ways. It's easy to give up on optimism and be negative or nihilistic. And I'm obviously not going to be part of any good solutions if I've done that, right? Nor will I have much any fulfillment. It's possible to have faith that doesn't require me to act, because I have faith that some other institutions or other people or God or magic will fix it all. And that's also obviously not useful. And it's easy to say, I'll have faith when someone shows me a solution that seems like it makes sense and tells me what I can do about it, which is it's
not faith.
Consciousness of a child,
Yeah.
right, that needs some parent authority figure to explain to them how to live. There's a certain kind of like, well, how would anyone ever come up with a solution to something that we don't know how to solve? Like, how does any inventor or innovator do it? Is that they have a faith that a solution exists before they know what it is. That doesn't have them just chill. It has them work their ass off to figure out what it is, right? So there's a certain faith in possibility that orients you to be an agent of it, which orients you to actually work at things that you don't know exactly how to do, right? And so then you end up having a faith in the actual solutions as they're gaining traction, but you get those through a process of a more intangible faith, but that orients you to learning, discovery, and action.
Yeah. One of the ways that you could describe MDMA is as an empathogen. And, obviously the first time I did it was in conjunction with psilocybin, and that's a very different experience and I was out in the mountains and I was in it was guided by a shaman, and it was a different scenario than the first time I did MDMA, which was in Australia with my girlfriend. And we were walking around downtown Brisbane. And I understand the term empathogen because for the very first time, I saw the city life, the nightlife, past midnight nightlife of bustling Bris Vegas, as they call it, but I saw it in a totally different way. That woman who was a little bit drunk but crying on the sidewalk probably went through a breakup or a fight with her boyfriend. I could feel what she felt, and I was like, "Oh my God!" Like that poor woman, and that that homeless person who was hungry. Like I could feel his hunger. And it was a very interesting experience where I felt love for people that were beyond the people that I normally allot my love to. And so I guess, to me, a lot of people are going to be pretty soon here within a year or so, give or take, depending on FDA and a few variables, are going to be going into MDMA psychotherapy for the healing of trauma. But many of us have trauma, so I'm sure the indications are going to increase, and then other different indications are going to be proven. It's going to be used off-label. There's going to be a lot of different proliferation of this as an empathogen. And so while it doesn't seem like there's going to be any end to the painkillers, although a more stoic philosophy and a different attitude towards pain could be a culturally relevant story of like, no, we must feel the pain. The pain is a signal. Stop numbing the pain so that you can actually solve the pain, which is a very empowering message, which I think can carry some weight. There will always be a market for painkillers, but also at the same time, raising people's sensitivity to collective pain through empathogenic molecules. And I think MDMA is just the first of potential empathogenic molecules that actually can connect people to collective pain in a different way. I mean, if, I just released a documentary about my time in the darkness, and I take off my blindfold for the first time, and you see me, I'm weeping at an unbelievably, intense depth of the grief of having taken this world for granted and the beauty that I'm beholding. And you can't watch that. I guess you could, but I haven't had an experience of someone watch that and not feel a bit of what I felt. Like, we're wired also for that level of empathy. And I think it's about being able to switch that back on, whether it's through stories or whether it's through media, whether it's through chemicals or whether it's some technological way in which, empathy is being trained. I think Andrew Huberman was talking to me about different empathy research that they were doing in the lab with VR goggles, where they were having you be a person of color and going into a racially charged situation and then feeling what that feels like and how impactful that was. It seems like there's a lot of different ways, for the mind that needs, and I understand like the feeling of a solution, just knowing that there is a solution, I think that's important. But for the mind that needs to say, well, I need some plausible limb to hang on to, some vine I can grab onto to give me some rational reason. I think there's a lot of shit that's happening that can give at least enough to support your faith that the solution is available. And I think that to me leaves me with the sense of optimism, which I don't know exactly how it'll be, but I can see a lot of different channels of stories changing, philosophies changing, understandings changing, different ideas about our spirituality changing, these compounds that are coming online, technology being used in beneficial ways. all of that is enough for me to say, like, all right, I believe because I believe, but there's a couple good reasons to believe as well. And I guess for me, that's enough for me to leave this conversation without going into my dark room and just crying softly into a pillow somewhere.
I think a couple things I want to say. One thing that you said that's important is that there are things that you see that are inspiring in a lot of different areas. It's important to recognize the basis of hope or solution is not a single thing, right? Because it's like there's some stuff we see in material science that makes better solar panels possible and better batteries possible and things like that, and better recycling and manufacturing of goods possible. And there's some things in the application of AI to personalizing education that could make completely better types of education possible, and some things that we see in psychedelics. And so but that also doesn't mean that we can say we don't also see applications of those technologies that are super destructive. And so we can't just say the techno-optimist version, it's all happening, it's all good, just let the market do its thing and it'll happen, and tech do its thing. It's not true. But it's also not true to say that there aren't the precursors to adequate solutions. But also it's not one thing, it's lots of things, right? So then there's a whole ecosystem of solutions. What do they have in common? We can get that, like, whether we're talking about tragedy of the commons or arms races, there's something in common to escalating competition for narrow success metrics that externalizes harm to lots of things, where that thing has to change across the scope writ large. And that's why we're talking about culture and the mindsets of people that could build new types of social institutions and even better versions of what we think of as the market right now. I want people to not think about, like, oftentimes they'll hear about the crisis and be like, what is the solution? As if there's like some singular thing someone could say that would make any sense. And that's nonsense. It's not going to be the solution, not the second coming, or just let the market do its thing, or AI will solve everything. So it's like, well, what are the problems? There's a whole scope of things, and it's a lot of stuff that has to happen. Then seeing how it's all connected is important, but it's not going to fit into a tweet. And so expanding your attention span to not say, my hope, you've got like 90 seconds to give me the solution of the thing I'll feel hope about. And if I don't have that, then I'm going to jump to either nihilism or some kind, like, that's important. The other thing I was going to say is you were mentioning that people are oriented towards sensations they want to have, not necessarily the thing. The thing is a path to it. And then you were talking about the spiritual experience and sensations that were occurring that were decoupled from external things happening, right? You were, rather than all the things you needed to get in the world, you were even more overwhelmed sensationally by how much you had taken for granted all the little things in the world, even. Like that there is such a thing as color at all, right? As opposed to
or sight itself.
Yeah. Or a reality to see, or the fact that reality happens to be as fucking beautiful as it is. When you're having that experience, it's very recontextualizing to the other state of mind that can really obsess over exactly what stuff your house is made of, right? So it's interesting. There's something where you're saying, like, okay, I want certain kinds of sensations. As long as those sensations are based on just what's happening in the external world, I will have a basis to need to compete with the other guy to rearrange my external world better than his, or with those scarce resources. One way you can think about what the heart of almost all spiritual traditions were trying to do was deal with that basis of conflict by being able to say, can you find something like peace and happiness unconditional to external? Can you find those sensations internally so that you are no longer driven to get sensations? There's this very interesting question that says, like, okay, as long as happiness is really conditional, but I need it, I have almost no free will. I'm basically controlled by this tyrant of unconditional happiness to pursue whatever I think will give me those hits of sensation. If I've already been able to cultivate an inner state that I'm happy with, then what is my basis for what I want? It's probably something other than my own state. So it's almost like, and this is why do you start your day with the right kind of meditation, whatever, is it's actually only when I have tended to my own state that real virtue can even emerge. where I can want something other than what's in it for me.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is another real deep basis of spiritual personal development is virtue can emerge authentically more when I've tended to my own state. And I can tend to my own state independently of rearranging the atoms in the universe to be a particular way. The last thing I was going to say is what you were mentioning about psychedelics and the empathogens, the MDMA. So imagine if you had this experience and you feel the hunger of the homeless guy and you feel the heartbreak of the woman and all the people. And afterwards, you come and journal about it. And you ask yourself, how do I tangibly change my life starting tomorrow to be aligned with what I just realized? And you have to come up with some fucking answers. Otherwise, the journey didn't mean anything, right? Like if it really changed how I'm understanding the world, how does it tangibly change my basis for choice? So we don't just do the journey, have an experience, and then it's a nice story. It's like I'm now inquiring. I have a deeper understanding of reality. How do I live differently? And then I look at how do I create a community of practice where then I share that as a commitment. I'm held accountable to that, right? With other people. And then the next time I journey, I take another step similarly. And then the other part is when you're like, okay, I would arms race with that guy who wanted to compete with me for the thing that I want. What if the next time I go into my psychedelic experience and I do the mushrooms or the iboga that's going to let me see myself? What if I journal first? What are all the places where I can be shitty? What are all the bases where I can go into otherizing people, losing empathy, and just going into conflict? Or let's say I'm going to do the empathogen. I say, what are all the places, who are the people that are hardest for me to empathize with? Mm-hmm. And then I go in and I only think about them on the empathogen. Or I look specifically at those places where I can have the lower angels of my nature kind of take hold. The psychedelics start to become much more interesting when the tool is used consciously, where you think about, okay, all these problems in the world have to do with conflict theory multiplied by tech. So we need to deal with the basis of the conflict theory, but we need to not pretend that it's not there. So how do I inventory where that conflict theory arises in my own life? Then how do I use those psychedelics to help me transcend how I deal with it? Like, how do I deal with it better? That starts to get very interesting.
No doubt, because there'll be some benefit that's gained just from the experience itself, but it's multiplied. It's multiplied, not added. It's multiplied by the intentionality behind it and the structure of doing those similar things, which sometimes can naturally arise in the nature of a traumatic experience. Usually there's a perpetrator of said trauma, and you will be often invited to go find the place of forgiveness for that perpetrator, which is the ultimate alchemy of the trauma. As I've watched this arc, I've been in the room during the MDMA assisted psychotherapy. I've been blessed to be a part of these different scenarios. And you watch the rage, which is hiding the grief. And then behind the grief is the forgiveness and then the release of that thing. And that's the way that the process is guided, but it's very self-guided as well. But to do that with intentionality, not just in the specific of this person did this thing to me, but in the universal, like, how do I really... It's very powerful and a good like little star, a little asterisk to put up upon this kind of revolution that we're on the precipice of.
And in a community of practice of other people who are doing similar. So if I have a blind spot I'm missing, where I'm assessing where I can be an asshole or go into unnecessary conflict, other people can show me, hey, you're missing this place. I'm like, oh, okay, good. That's helpful. And where if I'm really growing or not, there's other people that can help assess, actually, you keep talking about the same shit journey. So that we're not kind of narcissistically deluding ourselves and then just having the journey be another sensation we like to have. Like, are we actually really growing? Being able to help each other with that is very, very important part of it.
Well, as always, Daniel, these conversations are some of my favorite experiences that I am fortunate to have. I'm glad we get to share this conversation with the world, and whether it's just us in a restaurant or broadcast to all the people over the internets, it's really a pleasure. And I'm just deeply grateful for you and your heart and your work and your mind and everything you're doing. I want people to know too that I'm a significant contributor to the foundations that you're a part of. And I'm going to continue to do that, because I really believe in the work that you're doing, as I believe in my own abilities to, play some role in this cosmic orchestration. But so if you want to just explain briefly what those are, if people are interested in supporting your work as we make our way through this thing together.
Yeah. You being an ally in the way that you have has been hugely helpful to work that we've been able to do with talking to key government institutions about shifts that they can make, and also work that we're embarking on now and helping education in these areas more widely culturally. Something people can check out now is the consilienceproject.org. Consilienceproject.org is the website. A lot of the issues we were talking about today regarding propaganda, social media, culture issues, there's a whole good series of articles on there. We're about to do a series that addresses a 10 article series that is like the most fundamental things about what the state of the world is and what it would take to come to a post-exponential tech viable civilization. And really grateful you have helped us be able to do that work, and would love to have more people check it out and be involved. And then in terms of like, where do I find hope? I guess the last thing I'll say is there's this model that I like. We're actually about to write a paper on this. This guy, Marvin Harris, developed a school of cultural anthropology called cultural materialism. Really profound, insightful work. I don't agree with some of the conclusions, but he basically said you can think of civilization as the result of these three categories: infrastructure, social structure, and superstructure. Infrastructure is all the tooling, energy, transportation, waste management, modes of production. Social structure is like economics, governance, law, the institutions with which we mediate our agreements. And the superstructure is more like what we think of as culture, which is what are the values that we're orienting towards? What is the definition of the good life that we're orienting towards? So religion and nationalism and various kind of social ideologies live here. What he focused on was what we were starting to talk about at the beginning, which was the plow was so much more productive than just hunting and gathering from the point of calories you could produce, that the plow basically meant anyone who would do the plow thing would get ahead over those who wouldn't. So it coded for a pattern of behavior, which ended up coding for a mindset, because it meant those who were not animistic were going to get ahead from those who were animistic, even if being animistic made them more in harmony with their environment. So he focused on the way that tools, the infrastructure, ends up driving social structure and superstructure. We can do a deep analysis, we'll show this in this paper, of how all three of them interaffect each other. The nature of what is being economically incented determines which tools take off, also what's being regulated. The value systems can orient what we're doing science and exploration of, those types of things. Ultimately, the superstructure, the values of what matter to us, like the causal arrows from technology to drive our social structures, to drive our superstructure, is destructive. Like most of the destruction we have comes from that direction. This other direction, which is what are the values that we then encode into social structures? So how do we basically have a value system become the basis of law and rule of law that can then bind and direct the technology to be uses of tech that are not catastrophic and not dystopic, but actually in service of life? So our technology has gotten so powerful and it's kind of eroded our social structures and our superstructure. All that's left of the social structures of this kind of liberal democracy period is really like money on money returns and some very limited stuff. And mostly what's left of superstructure is like fairly self-centered nihilism and narcissism and nihilism. But so the development of culture to then have people of, for, by the people create new institutions that we can actually trust, put faith in, have rule of law that can then bind, guide, and direct the tech so that we can have a future that is high tech and high meaning, high nature, is kind of the only path. And I see that what you've already been doing with your podcast, and where I see it going, conversations we've had, being how do we really help the cultural revolution to be the basis of rebuilding social institutions that can have the power to be able to guide this godlike tech that we have, where we're good stewards of it, is Yeah. Of all the things where I feel hope, it's not the tech. The question is what's going to guide the tech. Right. And it has to be people that have evolved in these ways.
Para bien de todos, as Don Howard was fond of saying, for the good of all. And may we be put to good use. And I'm honored to walk this path with you, brother. As we said when we were walking from the restaurant, we've all lived in such a rich and beautiful way in which there's been moments of our life that have been so phenomenal and stunning that, you know, we've lived well enough to be able to really dedicate ourselves truly to service. And sure, there's moments of selfishness and there's moments where, you know, I lose my hunger for service, but I do know that when I'm deeply in service and I know I'm in service, there's no better drug on the planet. There is no better fucking drug than service when you're taking it pure. And I think we both tasted that drug too. And I'm looking forward to a lot more of that drug, however, in which way ever it takes me in this life.
Likewise. All right.
All right. Much love, my brother. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in.
Much love.
Embrace what you know from direct experience, what you know right now, what you know from having gathered here together. You know something. Can you even put it into words? Maybe not. But it happened. Here we are. Look. You felt things. Those are real. And you'll go back to routines, social surroundings that are at odds with what you have experienced and what you've known here. The more deeply you enter into that, the more it seems like this wasn't real. This is just some games we were playing. I didn't feel those things. I didn't see what I saw. That's gaslighting yourself. The bad news that I'm going to tell you is that force of will alone is not enough to stop that from happening. You can set the intention, I'm going to remember. I saw something here. I felt something. I experienced myself in a different way. Something of me was expressed. I saw something of what life is revealed. I'm going to hold on to that. I'm going to do a practice around it. If you are able to hold on to it, it may be because you tried hard, but it won't be only because you tried hard. I'm not telling you not to try. But what I'm saying is something else is required to hold on to that. And what I'm talking about actually is to hold on to sanity. Sanity is to believe what you know. It doesn't get any simpler than that. It's real. To live as if something that is real is not real, that is insanity. And the bad news is you can't hold on to it through will alone. How do you hold on to it? With a little help from your friends. That's why I say sanity is a group project. You need something to counteract the reinforcing circumstances of the default society in order to stay sane. You have met people here you trust. They will not betray you. They will not lie to you. When you ask them, is it real? Even if they are in despair, they will be called by your trust into truth because your trust is authentic. The story that we tell about another person, the way that we see another person, is a powerful invitation to them to be that. That's the essence of coaching. It's I see you as who you can be. And I'm not making it up. Even if in a month or 2 months, you may be again in a place of despair, where the reality of this moment is a distant memory. Even so, you will come back to this. And more. You will come to what this promises. And by sitting a moment in gratitude for it, you establish it more firmly as home base. These 3-4 days will never happen again. You cannot hold on to them. But something of them is in you. Maybe you have doubts, but at the same time, along with those doubts, you know that it is true. You know that the world can be built on this. You know that there is a future that has sent even its bare shadow, which is already so beautiful, to the present. Staying sane means that you stay in the knowledge of this, that it is true. And I don't think anybody here is going to stay sane. But there's an island of sanity. And to establish it more firmly, take a little more time.
Thanks for tuning into this video. Make sure you hit subscribe, follow me at Aubrey Marcus, check out the Aubrey Marcus podcast, available everywhere, and leave a comment. Let me know if this video resonated or what else you would like to hear from me in the future. Thank you so much.